So let's talk first about the logical version of the problem of suffering. Now, according to the logical version of the problem of suffering, it's impossible for God and the suffering in the world to both exist. They're like the irresistible force and the immovable object. If one exists, then the other one does not exist. And since suffering obviously exists, it follows that God does not exist. Now, the key to this argument is the atheist's claim that it's impossible that both God and suffering exist. The atheist is claiming that the following two statements are logically incompatible. Oh, no, go back. There we are. Are logically incompatible with each other. That an all-loving, all-powerful God exists, and that suffering exists. He's saying these two are logically incompatible with each other. Now, the obvious question is, why think that these two statements are logically inconsistent? After all, there's no explicit contradiction between them. One is not the negation of the other. So if the atheists think that there's some hidden, implicit contradiction between them, he has to be making some hidden assumptions that would bring out this contradiction and make it explicit. So the question is, what are those hidden assumptions? Well, there seem to be two hidden assumptions made by the atheist. And they are, if God is all-powerful and all-loving, then he can create any world that he wants, and he prefers a world without suffering. So the argument here is that God is all-loving and all-powerful, therefore he both can and wants to create a world without suffering, and therefore it follows that the world has no suffering. But that contradicts premise B above, that suffering exists, and therefore God must not exist. So this does seem to identify the hidden assumptions that the atheist is making. Now the question is, are these hidden assumptions necessarily true? In order for the argument to be valid, both of these assumptions have to be necessarily true. But are they? Well, consider the first one, that if God is all-powerful, then he can create any world that he wants. Is that necessarily true? Well, not if it's possible that people have free will. It's logically impossible to make someone freely do something. That's as logically impossible as an unmarried, or rather a married bachelor, or a round triangle. God's being all-powerful doesn't mean that he can bring about the logically impossible. And indeed, there is no such thing as the logically impossible. It's just an inconsistent combination of words. So the fact that God is omnipotent doesn't imply that he can make people freely do something. Now, notice, if the unbeliever insists that an omnipotent being can do the logically impossible, then the problem of evil just evaporates immediately, because then God can bring it about that both he and the suffering in the world coexist, even though that's logically impossible. So if the atheist says God, because he's omnipotent, can do the logically impossible, then there just is no problem of evil. God can bring about the coexistence of himself and evil, even though that's logically impossible. Now, since it is possible that people have free will, it turns out that this first assumption is not necessarily true. If people have freedom of the will, then they may refuse to do what God desires for them to do. So there may be any number of possible worlds which God cannot create because the people in them wouldn't cooperate with God's desires. In fact, for all we know, it's possible that any world of free persons with as much good as the actual world would also involve as much suffering as the actual world. Now, that conjecture doesn't need to be true or even probable, as long as it's even logically possible. it shows that it's not necessarily true that God can create just any world that he wants. So this first assumption is just not necessarily true, and on that basis alone, the atheist's argument is logically invalid. It's fallacious. But what about the second assumption? If God is all-loving, he prefers a world without suffering. Is that necessarily true? Well, it doesn't seem like it. For God could have overriding reasons for allowing the suffering in the world. We all know cases in which we permit suffering in order to bring about a greater good. We all know cases in which we allow suffering to enter a person's life because of greater goods that we have in mind. Now, the atheist might insist that an all-powerful being would not be so limited. He could just bring about the greater good directly without allowing any suffering. But clearly, given freedom of the will, that may not be possible for God. Some goods, for example, moral virtues, can be achieved only through the free cooperation of people. And it may be the case that a world with suffering is, on balance, better overall than a world with no suffering. In any case, it's at least possible that it is, and that's enough to defeat the atheist's claim that this second assumption is necessarily true. So the point is that the atheist, in asserting these two assumptions, is taking on a burden of proof which is so heavy that it's really unsustainable. He would have to show that free will is impossible and that it's impossible that a world with suffering is better overall than a world with no suffering. Now, we can actually push the argument a notch further. I think we can make it plausible that God and suffering are logically consistent. In other words, what I've argued so far is that the atheist has failed to show that they're inconsistent. He's failed to show they're inconsistent. Now I want to go on the offense. I think we can show plausibly that they are consistent. Now, in order to do this, all we need to do is to come up with another statement which is consistent with God's existence and which entails that suffering exists. And here is such a statement. God could not have created another world with as much good but less suffering than this world, and God has good reasons for permitting the suffering that exists. The idea here is that given human freedom, God's options are restricted. And it may be that a world with as much good as the actual world, but with less suffering, wasn't an option for God. Nevertheless, God has good reasons for permitting the suffering that he allows. Now, if this statement is even possibly true, it doesn't need to be true or plausible. If it's even possibly true, then it shows that it's possible that God and suffering coexist. And surely it's plausible that this statement is possibly true. And therefore, I'm very pleased to be able to report to you this afternoon that after centuries of discussion, the books on the logical version of the problem of evil have been closed. It is widely admitted by both atheist and theist philosophers alike that the logical version of the problem of suffering has failed. The burden of proof that it lays on the atheist's shoulders is simply too heavy, namely trying to show that the coexistence of God and suffering is impossible. That's just too heavy a burden of proof for the atheist to shoulder.